How y'all doing, ladies and gentlemen? This is Mario Matthews, owner and operator of MinutesTillDawn Productions. MinutesTillDawn Productions is an entertainment media production company focused on empowering black families. And today we are going to be discussing the recent Seattle town hall meeting hosted by Converge Media and Cube 93 and other media partners in the city of Seattle, Tacoma, Puget Sound area. But before we get into the video, please like, please share, please subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you feel so inclined to support this channel, you can do so in the link below. You can donate as much as you like. I really appreciate all the love, all the help, and all of the support. And let's get into it. So, first, I'd like to thank Converge Media and Cube 93 and their media partners for hosting this town hall. It was very well needed, and it was it was a really good presentation. So much kudos to everyone involved in the process, and thank y'all. Thank y'all. Now, with that being said, first, just know that this interview, or it was in the town hall, was sort of laid out in an interview format where you had, the first interviews were two people. It was Director Hershey from District 7 and Councilman Zahile from District 2. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing that wrong. And the second interview, or the more of a presentation, that it was more of a presentation than an interview. Nikita Oliver and her camp, they had presentations going on, and then afterwards it was Mayor Durkin and her team. That was more of an interview format, and So the format was broken up into those categories. I like the format. I like the presentation. Nikita Oliver and her camp, their part kind of stood out as compared to the others because it was more of them giving this sort of, it almost felt like almost a state of the union per se, rather than interviews and rather than interviews or whatnot. So it kind of stood out in that regard. I'm not sure if that was intentional. It probably was intentional, but it just seemed like it broke the format a little bit. So, with that being said, that was that. They did had their piece, and that's perfectly fine. It just, that felt inconsistent, but hey, it is what it is. Okay, so let's get into the content, shall we? So first up was Director Haley of District 7, school board, director, and Councilman. Oh, I'm sorry. Director Hershey from District 7, school board, and Councilman Zahaley, District 2. Okay, in Skyway. Now, throughout the first thing right off the bat, was this sort of numerous times mentioning black and brown POC BIPOC. Okay. Now, one of the points of contention here is that throughout these interviews, all three, Nikita Oliver, Mayor Durkin, and these two directors, or rather Director Hershey and Councilman Zahaley, everybody kept mentioning black and brown, POC, and BIPOC. Ladies and gentlemen, from the presentation that we've seen, are we here to discuss black politics? Are we here to discuss a black agenda? If so, why are we continuously bringing up people from other communities intertwined into internal affairs of black people? Can somebody explain to me the resources and the equity that is being shared amongst races that lifts the black race from its current place at the bottom of every socioeconomic statistic that we have to date. For 50 years we've been on this train. 50 years. Okay? There hasn't been any formal meetings, no treaties. There haven't been any coalition, quote unquote, building that our councilmen and our representatives would like to suggest. It's like, yo, are we having a conversation about the black community, or are we having an all lives matter conversation? Pick one. Pick one. Because the language says it all. If we are constantly mentioning black and brown, then we're not talking about the black community. If we are constantly mentioning BIPOC, then we are definitely not talking about the black community. If we are mentioning POC, which is essentially the mother of BIPOC, we are not talking about the black community. So, ladies and gentlemen, I implore you to come correct. Come correct. Either we're having a discussion about black people, race specific, or we are having an all lives matter discussion. You can't have both. You cannot have both. Period. Continuing. Director Hershey from District 7 mentioned 3 things that he has done over, or policies rather, that him and his, him and his cabinets, or, his other council members or whatnot have you, that they have passed, policies that they have passed over the summers to address students in their, in their district. Number 1, he mentioned removing SEOs from schools. SEOs are police officers, so he removed the police officers from school. Student community workforce agreements and one-on-one electronic devices for students regarding remote learning. Now, all of these things are admirable. They're very admirable, all of these things. However, once again, all of these things are not exclusive to black students, let alone black families who have now an increased load of work and responsibility, which they already should have had, if you ask me. But in the circumstances of COVID-19, students who are Black American descendants of slavery now find themselves in a precarious position where many families can't even afford the equipment in which is needed to have a proper education. If we are talking about Black American descendants of slavery in this country, the same families who trace their ancestors back to the slave fields in which they built America through blood, sweat, and tears. We are talking about a discussion from regarding stolen wealth and resources from former slave owners and their descendants. Ladies and gentlemen, as admirable as these points are, they miss the mark. Again, are we talking about the Black community? Because I don't see it. These are not specific to the Black community. Moving on. Councilman Zalehi spoke exclusively about community centers and commercial tenants owning their own buildings. property ownership, and community centers are admirable. Again, these are admirable things. However, these are not specific to the Black community. These things are accessible by all communities. Are we having a discussion about Black people, Black families, Black communities, or are we having an all lives matter discussion? Moving on, Miss Nikita Oliver. Now, in the beginning of her presentation, she repeatedly spoke about Black and Native American sovereignty being interconnected. We're running into the same problem again and again and again. I'm fairly certain that when the agendas of Native American tribes throughout the country are being brought up in their meeting rooms, there is no interjection in regards to Black people. So why is it happening here? Why is there so much interjections happening when it comes to Black people and our discussions? Why are we bringing up all these other different groups that clearly have different agendas, different lineages, different justice claims, different histories in this country, which deserve their own platforms, and rightfully so? However, our interconnectedness stops when it comes to socioeconomic benefits that is specific to Black people, more specifically to Black American descendants of slavery, ADOS people. Again, are we having a Black discussion? Are we having a Black communal discussion? Continuing, the person named Sean, Miss Sean, spoke about the Black Brilliance Project and brought up three things that the Black Brilliance Project sort of spearheaded. They spoke to people within the community, and I'm guessing Black people, and they didn't specify what, the lineage, ethnicities of these Black folks. They didn't specify any of that. So here we go. They asked them three things. One, skills. What skills do you have to overcome? I don't really know. They didn't get into specifics, and they have a website, but I'm just going to go off the list of what was told. They asked about skills. They asked about needs, and they asked about what would you do as a Black person? How would you invest $200 million if you were to have it? Ladies and gentlemen, listen. Black American descendants of slavery own less than the numbers from the Federal Reserve does not make that distinction. However, Black Americans, including American immigrants, own less than 3% of the U.S. wealth in regards to our population numbers. Like, we own less than 3% of the wealth in the entirety of the U.S. And this was before COVID-19. How bad do you think the numbers are now? After historic layoffs, 60% of Black businesses probably won't even exist after this is all over. And we're sitting here having hypothetical conversations. What will we do with $200 million if we so magically have it? Like, ladies and gentlemen, I implore you to focus on that which is tangible. Enough with the hypothetical conversations. If we are going to have studies, then it is important that we pinpoint the groups we pinpoint the groups that needs to be specifically targeted and make sure to get those resources to those people in forms of liquidity, assets, and getting it into the hands of those families. Moving on. Personal stories were told, and it spoke about restorative justice, like personal stories were being told, which is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, okay? However, in one part of the personal stories, it spoke about the solutions to problems are restorative justice counselors and healing circles. People, I am not opposed to therapy. As a matter of fact, on a national scale, reparations specifically to American descendants of slavery should include lineage therapy, as told from, Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore. I completely agree with that. Yes, therapy is very important. However, let there be no mistake. At this particular point in time in history, after you receive counseling from reparation or restorative justice counselors, and after you attended healing circles, you have to go back out here in the real world where there are constantly people who have pledged their allegiance to an ideology that sees us as less than human. We have to work with these folks. We have to live beside these folks. And we have to somehow coexist in a place where our very existence is relegated to that less than an animal. Ladies and gentlemen, unless reparation is holistically approached, this restorative justice counselors and healing circles, that's a Band-Aid. That's a Band-Aid. Okay? It's a Band-Aid. Moving on. Now, Nikita Oliver mentioned some numbers, and this is what I like. I like to hear that. Numbers. Let's get into it, shall we? $410 million for SPD from the SPD budget to be taken, and Nikita wants 50% of that $410 million from the Seattle Police Department's budget. That's not a bad point. That's not a bad point at all. Now, there was a mention, however, that this will be given to community-based programs. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not Black specific. Community-based programs means anyone who's in a community, meaning it would go to anybody, including white people. Again, are we having a Black discussion, or are we having a All Lives Matter discussion? Pick one. Moving on. Acknowledge. Now, Nikita Oliver, during the end of her segment, she did acknowledge Jim Crow, slavery, segregation, etc. but there was no mention of reparations specifically to American descendants of slavery. As a matter of fact, there was no mention of the words or the term or the ethnicity Black American descendants of slavery. Now, I find this to be very disrespectful, Miss Nikita Oliver, to utilize slavery, the institution of slavery that purposely created an underclass of Black American descendants of slavery, to be a bottom caste in a country. And when we were, quote unquote, freed after the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, our ancestors were then subjected to black codes, Jim Crow laws, race riots, burnings and bombings and hangings. And then subsequently, we were excluded from the New Deal after the Great Depression. And our communities were flooded with drugs and guns that we did not create. And then when we were corralled into prisons via mass incarceration, which brings us to now. Our historic wealth inequality that has brought us to the point to where we are now. It is highly disrespectful to use the history of Black American descendants of slavery to push all of these other kinds of agendas, whether we're talking about the Green New Deal, whether we're talking about BIPOC initiatives, people of color, Black and brown, Black and indigenous. As far as I'm concerned, you are using the history, the lineage, and the cost of being a Black American descendant of slavery in this country to push the agenda for all other ethnicities besides the very people in which you get that history from. It is highly disrespectful. Highly disrespectful. I say this once again. Are we having a Black discussion or an all lives matter discussion? Moving on. Joaquin actually had a brief mention, or he had a brief sort of presentation during Nikita Oliver's time. And I love this part because he brought the data. He brought actual data that shows clearly that this sort of BIPOC POC narrative that we're trying to sort of have in this broader discussion, that resources and equity is not being evenly exchanged. It's clear by the numbers. However, I like to also suggest, and this is where those numbers fell short, maybe on, I don't know whether or not Joaquin was responsible for this, or maybe, King County Equity Now was responsible for this. I don't know where the numbers came from. However, I can tell you by looking at those numbers were not specific to Black ADOS people, Black American descendants of slavery. The Black category also included many other folks from around the world who immigrated here to this country and do not have the same story, do not have the same lineage, do not have the same history, and do not share the same amount of cost that comes with being an American, a Black American descendant of slavery. And that's where those numbers fell short, unfortunately. Continuing, Afterwards, we had a brief conversation with Mayor Durkin and her team. And it was mentioned that there was an executive order earlier yesterday on August 1st that was signed that transfers some of the Seattle Police Department's functions to the community. Now, we didn't go into specifics on that. There were no specifics given. We don't know what functions or any of that nature is being handed over to the community. It's very vague. And honestly, I don't see what is that supposed to do? There were nothing given. There were no information given. And there were discussions about how later on next week, cabinet members will be discussed or cabinet members will be appointed. So at the moment, everything is still, or committee members rather, who will be spearheading this sort of initiative. So next week, that's going to be a thing. I may talk about it more at that time when we have more information and more details. But as far as of now, this just seems up in the air. And honestly, the presentation, the interviews and the questions that were being given to Ms. Durkin and her cabinet, like they were very softball questions. Okay? Very softball questions. Now, towards the end of Mayor Durkin's interview, she briefly mentions how her cabinet understands and acknowledges that Black Americans and Black people have been relegated to the bottom of a caste system. And our history is being erased. Our communities is being erased from Seattle. And reparations is needed. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the only time throughout this entire process that it was even mentioned about reparations. And we didn't even get into any specifics. We didn't get into any distinctions and designations when it comes to lineage and justice claims. We didn't get into any of that. This was very disrespectful. Okay? We just spoke about it like it was just a passing thing, like it was a fad that was going to go away tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point of the video, I'd like to discuss sort of the key issues that are being faced in Seattle when it comes to the Black community. Number one on a lot of people's minds is COVID-19, okay? It is quite obvious that a lot of Black people have bore the brunt of COVID-19, mainly because we are relegated to frontline essential worker positions in our society. Okay? And we now have a situation in which we are the most exposed to this pathogen. Amazon released a report not too long ago discussing how their own employees, a whole thousands of employees have been exposed to COVID-19. Amazon is based right here in Seattle. What are we doing about that? How are those people essential workers, many of which are Black, here in this city, contracting a virus that we are supposed to have a handle on? How is that being addressed? We have black people dying because they do not have the proper PPE in order, or even the luxury of removing themselves from this situation so they don't have to be the ones to contract it. How are we helping these families? Number 2, gentrification and homelessness. There was a report released last year by Stanford News, and this is Stanford University, EDU News, that shows just how immigration is not only being affected by the black community in regards to, rich white folks from various places across the world, or across the country rather, but also immigration is also assisting in the rapid pace of gentrification in black communities in Seattle. What are we doing as a city, as a state, in order to ensure that black people who have historic roots in this country, in this area, in this state, are able to have the resources and equity that was stolen from them via slavery and Jim Crow to remain in their historic areas in this country? No mention of it whatsoever. No mention of how these factors play a role into the replacement and erasure of black history here in the United States. Yet we're sitting here talking about BIPOC and people of color. I will leave a link in the description regarding that study from Stanford University. Number 1 on the list, reparations specific to a black American descendants of slavery. Here in this country, black Americans that are the descendants of slavery hold a unique justice claim that no other ethnicity, no other race has. Our resources and equity, our labor was stolen